I'm really pleased to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Gabby Ayres. Gabby is a research associate at Northern Arizona University, where she works with the Rocky Mountain Research Station on wildfire risk assessments and climate adaptation planning. Gabby recently completed her PhD in forest science at NAU, where she studied how tree growth responds to climate across a latitudinal gradient in the Rocky Mountains. She completed her undergraduate and Master of Science degrees at Rhodes University in South Africa. Gabby is an ecologist with a passion for exploring the planet's diversity, whose research has taken her from the savannas of South Africa to the ice fields of Antarctica, and more recently, the dry forests of the American West. We're really excited to have Gabby join us today, and with that, I'll turn it over to her.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Let me just share my screen. Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for tuning in today, and thank you to the Southwest Fire Consortium for hosting us. We really appreciate this platform for communicating science. So as Rachel mentioned, my name is Gabby Ayres, and today I'm going to be sharing some of my research from my PhD dissertation, which looked at non-dominant species, so aspen and Chihuahua pine, growing at their ecological margins in the Saguaro National Park. So this work was a collaboration between folks from Northern Arizona University, the University of Balearic Islands, and we had support from our partners in the National Park Service. And so whilst I'm speaking acknowledgements, I just want to take a moment to thank and acknowledge the many people who supported the project, from field technicians to technical advisors and our partners at the Saguaro National Park. The research was funded by the National Parks Service Reserve Fund, and it really represents a truly collaborative effort. So thanks to everybody who was involved. So here's a little bit of a roadmap for today. We will begin with the context and why the study matters. I'll introduce the two species to you all, and we'll walk through our dual approach method of dendrochronology and simulation modeling. And then I'll present some of the results and wrap up with implications for climate-informed forest management. So the big picture, why we're doing this work. So at the moment, climate change isn't really a distant concern. You know, it's here, it's reshaping ecosystems. And in the Southwest, we're seeing fires burn hotter, droughts are lasting longer, and our species are struggling to keep up. What makes this even more critical is where it's happening. And so we have high elevation forests in the Saguaro National Park that sit at the intersection of desert and montane ecosystems. And so there's this narrow climatic window where a few degrees of warming or a few inches of less rain can make or break an entire forest patch. And so they're really the canaries in the climate coal mine. They're small, isolated patches that are sensitive to change. And that's exactly why they're worth studying. You know, what happens here could be a preview of what's to come elsewhere. And so the Saguaro National Park is mostly known for its iconic cacti and desert landscape. But it also contains these high elevation forest fragments that are ecologically significant and provide multiple ecosystem services. These patches support species like aspen and Chihuahua pine that are rare in this particular region. And the Saguaro National Park was selected for this research because it directly aligned with the Fire Management Leadership Board priorities. So they needed ecological insight to guide climate fire planning in this landscape. So the Saguaro National Park offers a unique management setting. It has a long history of prescribed fire use, and so it gives us a baseline of how fires already been reintroduced. There is no elk in the park, which means that there's less browsing pressure, and that's especially important for understanding aspen dynamics. And then there's also designated wilderness area. And so that forces us to think creatively about what kinds of low impact treatments or non-mechanized treatments could be viable in the park. And so that brings us to the core of the study. How do key edge species like aspen and Chihuahua pine respond to both past climate variability and then projected future scenarios that include warming and fire? And so before we go further, I'm just going to introduce the species to you all. We'll start with aspen. It is a moisture-loving clonal species, and it thrives after disturbance. However, it is rare in arid landscapes like southern Arizona. And aspen in the Saguaro National Park only exists as scattered groves near the higher elevation mountaintops. Chihuahua pine, by contrast, is native to Mexico and the Southwest. It is drought tolerant. It is fire adapted. It's able to resprout after a fire event and regenerate from semi-serotinous cones. And so these two species occupy different elevations in the park. Aspen is slightly higher up and the Chihuahua pine is a little bit lower, but both are at the edge of their range. So aspen is at its southern edge distribution and the Chihuahua pine is at its northern edge distribution. And that makes them ideal case studies for climate fire vulnerability study. And so our objective was twofold. First, we wanted to assess how species had historically responded to climate. And then second, we wanted, and that was through using tree ring data. And then second, we wanted to simulate their future growth and persistence using climate FVS, which I'll go into a bit in a sec, and different climate scenarios and a extreme fire event. And so we expected aspen to show strong moisture sensitivity and decline under a warming climate, especially when coupled with fire. And we expected that Chihuahua pine would show more stable growth due to its fire and drought adaptive traits. And so here we have a study map giving you an indication of what the aspen and Chihuahua pine stands look like in the park. You'll see at the bottom left there, we have a temperature and precipitation figure showing that increasing temperature in the park at these two sites, and then a decrease in precipitation over time. And so, you know, the future of this landscape is a warmer, drier climate. And so our methods combined both a retrospective and a prospective approach. So in the field, we sampled cores from dominant aspen and pine trees, and we built tree ring chronologies and analyzed climate growth relationships. And then we also ran simulations in climate FVS that projected growth and viability from 2025, 50 years down the line to 2075. And under different RCP scenarios, emission pathways, and then also with a wildfire event in the year of 2035. So for those of you who are less familiar with it, dendrochronology is the scientific method of dating tree rings for the year that they were formed. It's essentially nature's archive. So every year a tree will put on a growth ring. Each ring is essentially a little timestamp of how that tree grew in a given year. So wide rings, happy tree; narrow rings, stressed tree, whether that's drought, cold, maybe a rough year all around. But what's useful for us as ecologists is that we can use these tree rings to track not just how much a tree grew, but why it grew that way. And we do this by linking these tree growth ring patterns to climate variables, fire, and even insect outbreaks. So to ensure that we're doing this properly, we use a cross-dating process. And this simply means that we match rings across samples and trees. So live, dead, long fallen logs. And we build these long-term chronologies that can go back as far as the age of the tree. So I'm going to give you kind of an outline of what the methods typically look like. So we start with collecting our samples out in the field. For our aspen, we collected samples from the Manning Camp Grove. For our Chihuahua pine, we collected on Chimeneo Peak and Heartbreak Ridge. And these samples typically look something like this. So we use an increment borer and we pull this tree core out of the tree. And then we take these cores back to the lab where they're mounted and sanded to produce something that looks like this, where we can clearly identify the annual ring boundaries. Once we've mounted and sanded them, we begin the cross-dating and measuring process. So we start by visually dating the cores where we mark each year. And then once we've done that, we scan these cores and then we digitally mark and measure the ring widths on the cores. And from there, we then verify these measurements. In our case, we used a software called Cofecha, but really you're just trying to assess the quality of the cross-dating and the measurement accuracy that you've done. So when you're good to go, you can produce your chronology. So we export those measurements and ring widths to use in an analysis, and we create what is called a ring width index. So your ring width index is a way of standardizing growth, kind of like asking, is this year's growth more or less what we would expect for this tree at this point in its life? So we take those raw ring width measurements, we remove the long-term growth trends caused by age and size, and then that way we're left with these signals, the ups and downs that are more likely caused by environmental factors like drought, temperature fluctuations, or even environmental stress. For any analysis, we need to ensure that we've got good replication of measurements. And so we look at what is called the signal strength, the subsample signal strength. And this is a statistical measure that evaluates how well a tree ring chronology reflects a common growth signal across all trees. So essentially how strong the shared signal is relative to the noise from individual tree variability. Higher values mean that the data set is giving you a more reliable shared signal, giving you more reliable shared signals across the cores. And so we cut off our chronologies at 0.85, and that prevents us from overinterpreting years where sample size could be too small to be meaningful. So we can also calculate an absolute growth measurement called basal area increment using these ring width measurements and our diameter at breast height. And basal area increment is a way of measuring how much wood a tree has added in a given year. So instead of looking at the width of the ring, we are calculating the actual area of wood that the tree has added to its trunk in that year. So because trees are generally round, as they get bigger, each ring covers a larger area, even if it's the same width. So if you think of a small tree putting on a 2 millimeter ring, that's a lot less wood than a larger tree putting on a 2 millimeter ring. And so basal area increment helps us get this accurate picture of how much real growth has happened for the trees. And then from there, we take these chronologies and we, do our climate correlation analysis. For this study, we used PRISM data. We looked at our temperature variables and precipitation variables from the PRISM climate data set. And we did our analysis in an R package called TreeClim, which, is a package designed for tree ring data. And then we also did a correlation analysis with the drought index, SPEI, or standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index. And so here is our basal area increment plots for each of the species from 1954 to 2020. This particular period was where that SSS cutoff was the same. Well, yeah, the data was the same for both species, overlapped. So that was our selected period of study. On the left, we have aspen. And so the aspen that was sampled in the Saguaro National Park were young. And so they likely regenerated after a past fire event. And so it's no surprise that we see that steady increase in growth early on. But then from about the 1990s, we see that growth becomes relatively stable. Which could reflect stand maturation or even be an emerging climate response. On the right, we have Chihuahua pine. So these trees were a lot older, they were already established, and so we don't see that early steady increase like we did in the aspen. But we do see some initial patterns of growth being a bit variable from year to year throughout the same years. And so in short, aspen shows that classic post-fire growth curve that levels off, and the pine is a bit more steadier, a bit more variable, and it's likely reflecting that sensitivity to year changes. And so here are some of the results where we looked at how growth using the ring width index chronology in each species correlates with climate variables over time. So on the left, we have these bar plots that show how tree growth relates to the monthly temperature and precipitation. Aspen in the orange is linked to late season precipitation, especially in that previous fall and then current year early spring. Chihuahua pine responds to a broader seasonal window. So you see a lot more of these significant relationships consecutively month to month. And its growth, as we would expect, is negatively affected by high temperatures across multiple months. The figure on the right, we did that correlation analysis with ring width index and SBI to see how growth responds to moisture stress over the different time scales. So on the x-axis, we have 6 to 48. So that's just representing your drought period. So shorter term, 6 months, all the way through to longer term droughts, your 48 months. Your y-axis are your months, and your correlations are shown through that heat map format. But when you're looking at this figure, what's important to note here is that we're not interpreting whether SBI was high, so wet, or low, so dry, but the correlation is really just showing how changes in moisture availability affects growth. So whether ring width index and SBI are moving in the same direction or not. So in a nutshell, positive correlation means that an increase in growth, there's an increase in growth when conditions are wetter and a decrease in growth when conditions are drier. And then obviously your negative correlation would be the opposite. So for aspen, we see neutral to weakly negative correlations, suggesting inconsistency to moisture availability and not what we expect. It seems a little counterintuitive. But this also was a bit of an indication that aspen could be responding to more to other factors like temperature. So at its range, it's at its hot fringe. And so heat stress might be more critical. One thing to think about. So aspen bud burst relies on warmer temperatures. So warmer than normal conditions could be triggering early leaf out in aspen in the park. And the park usually receives its precipitation from June through September. And so if you have early growth before moisture becomes available, the tree's likely using up its water, its stored carbohydrates, and then it's getting hit by that drought before the summer rains arrive. And so these results could potentially be pointing towards a phenological mismatch of some sort. Chihuahua pine, on the other hand, showed strong and more immediate correlations with short-term drought, positive correlations, suggesting that it does track that near-term moisture condition, those near-term moisture conditions. Similar to the correlations that we see in the plot on the left, it shows that pine is broadly responsive and perhaps a little bit more resilient under these changing variable conditions. And so we see that moderate to strong positive correlation, especially at that 6 to 8 month time scale during the summer, and indicating that, you know, strong sensitivity to monsoon moisture. All right, so moving on to the simulation side of the study. So we use the climate FVS. The forest vegetation simulator is a tool that is widely used by land managers because it's trusted, it's grounded in empirical growth data, and it's regionally calibrated. And so when we use it with the climate extension, although it's still a relatively simple model or tool compared to process-based models, it still gives us directionally consistent projections, especially when we pair it with our observational data in our tree ring results. And so here, it allowed us to simulate how each species might fare under future climate and an extreme wildfire event. And so we set up our simulations by creating monospecific stands at high and low density for each of the two species. And we applied 4 climate scenarios, so a 20th century climate, and then the 3 representation concentration pathway scenarios, so your emission scenarios. And then we simulated a high severity fire in 2035 to assess persistence. We also looked at the viability scoring, and so that's on a scale of 0 to 1. And these scores in the model adjust growth, mortality, and carrying capacity. And so it gives us this realistic sense of long-term suitability for each of the species under a changing climate. And so here were the viability results, and they were quite striking. So Aspen starts with low viability at approximately 0.3, and it declines steeply under warming, all of the trajectories pointing towards extirpation. Under the 4.5 scenario, it remains an unviable species. So, oh, sorry, I forgot to mention. So anything under 0.2 is considered, you know, unviable. So so under that 4.5 scenario, we are seeing that it is not a viable species on this landscape. For RCP scenarios 6.0 and 8.5, we see that aspen's probably not going to be present by the end of the century. Chihuahua pine started with a much higher viability score, so at about 0.65, and it declines more slowly, remaining above persistence thresholds, even under those high emissions. And so our simulation results, sorry, give me a sec, I don't know. There we go. Our simulation results of basal area echoed the patterns from these viability scores. So we'll start with aspen on the left. So under the 20th century conditions without fire, growth increased steadily and then levels off by about 2045. When we add fire in 2035, there's that initial drop, but it does fully recover under that 20th century baseline climate. When we start looking at the scenarios, so under the 4.5, growth stays relatively stable for a while, but then it begins to decline by 2070. Fire causes a small drop, but then it does stabilize again. Under the 6.0, we start to see some trouble. So growth declines steadily from 2035 onwards, and even fire doesn't stop that downward slide that we begin to see. And then under RCP 8.5, aspen's basically extirpated by mid-century, with or without fire. There's just no recovery under that extreme scenario. So now shifting to the Chihuahua pine on the right. The pine shows a lot more stability in terms of its trajectories. So under the no fire scenarios for the 20th century, the RCP 4.5 and the RCP 6.0, basal area holds steady or even increases slightly, especially in those low density stands. With fire, there is so with fire, there's that immediate drop across all the scenarios. But in most cases, we do see some recovery, albeit gradual. We see some recovery coming back in, except under that 8.5 scenario, where recovery sort of flatlines after about 30 years and declines. So the other thing just to point out here is that the fire does tend to hit the high density stands a bit harder. And that would be what we would expect, more intense fire effects in more crowded conditions. And so the takeaway from the simulation modeling was that Aspen is highly sensitive to both climate stress and disturbance, like fire, especially under that warm, dry future. Chihuahua pine is more resilient overall, but it's not invincible. So even under those extreme conditions, it still declines just a bit more slowly. And so moving on to the sort of findings of this, ultimately the two species are showing their two survival strategies in the park. Aspen is fast, opportunistic, it's clonal, but it's vulnerable to this cumulative drought and fire stress. Pine is slower growing, but it's more tolerant of fire and drought, offering more resilience under change. And then understanding these trade-offs is really critical for designing management strategies that will match each of these species' strengths if you have it. And so that empirical and modeled insight really gives us kind of a good look into, gives us some information to make informed decisions moving forward. And so what do we do with this? And what can park managers do to retain these species and the respective ecosystem services they offer? So for aspen, we might use low intensity prescribed fire or thinning to stimulate regeneration. But I think it would be really important to time it with wet years or wet conditions to reduce some of that drought stress. Thankfully, elk is not an issue in the park, so we don't have that browsing pressure, but conifer encroachment could be problematic. And so controlling that conifer encroachment could be critical. And then also these aspen stands are in the wilderness area in the park. And so hand thinning some of those conifers could help too. For the pine, maintaining the seed trees will be critical, and then avoiding overly frequent high severity fire will also help sustain regeneration. However, there's also some give for the Chihuahua pine. So they have the potential in this landscape to move up slope and occupy areas with more favorable environmental conditions. And so managers could consider facilitating this assisted migration. For both species, creating climate refugia is a viable path. So identifying and protecting climate refugia like cooler, wetter microsites, so your north-facing slopes or shaded drainages, and encouraging seedling establishment here could also offer these species a buffer against some of these extreme conditions we're expecting, especially for aspen. And yeah, ultimately, I think the main takeaway for the managers is that this all just needs to be grounded in adaptive management. So staying flexible and responsive as these climate conditions shift. Static plans aren't going to cut it, especially given the uncertainty of the future. And so I'll start to wrap up here. I just want to highlight some big picture takeaways from this work. So first, our edge species like the aspen and the Chihuahua pine are good indicators for climate stress. So they show us where the system is most vulnerable and where interventions might matter most. Second, we can combine tree ring data and modeling tools like climate FVS to give us a powerful planning framework. So one that shows us what's not only already happened, but then another that helps us explore what could happen. But this is the key, right? We can't treat these projections as with the models as fixed outcomes. And so we must be able to shift from static, one size fits all plans to true adaptive management. And that means building flexibility into how we respond to fire, to drought, and these shifting species dynamics. You know, climate isn't standing still, and so our management strategies can't either. And then finally, the future of dry montane forests may depend on our willingness to work with and not against disturbance like fire. And that means seeing fire not just as a threat, but as a tool and used wisely and strategically. And so I'll just take a quick sec to plug the story map that our colleague Sean Henning put together on this research. So if you'd like to explore the work a little bit more deeply, the story map has visuals, figures, and a bit more background on this project. So yeah, scan the QR code and take a look. And I guess with that, I will say thank you to everyone for, tuning in and listening, and I'll take some questions.
All righty, thank you so much, Gabby. That was a great presentation. So just a reminder for everyone online that you can post any questions that you might have in the chat, and they will be relayed to Gabby. I have a couple just to start us off. Early in your presentation, you mentioned that there may be a mismatch in Aspen between, precipitation and early growth. So just wondering how many years of early growth and delayed precipitation that doesn't necessarily match up with it can Aspen tolerate before you start seeing mortality?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have the exact answer for you. I think, that's really hard to kind of pull out with what we've done. I think if you were to kind of tune in to some of this more recent tree ring data, you'd get a better picture. But I would say that it's already happening. And so, if you're thinking about kind of these conditions shifting at the start of the century, it's probably, I would say it's been happening sort of like the last 10 to 20 years already. And so maybe not as immediate as we would expect. And at least some of the Aspen literature is saying the same, that, some of the more recent literature that's coming out saying like Aspen's a bit more resilient than we originally thought. And so, yeah, great question. I think, I think that would be a great study to dive into more depth and actually have a look and test, right?
Alrighty, so we'll look for a better answer or a more in-depth answer in the future. Catherine asked if there were any fire scars present in your dendrochronology record that might help calibrate the C-FVS response to those data, especially over time with repeat fires.
Yeah, so when we were sampling, we were we weren't sampling trees with fire scars. We were trying to get a better idea of kind of the growth relationships of these trees. So we were trying to avoid sampling trees that were affected by fire and things like that to really try and capture that climate signal. But absolutely, yes, to have fire scarred samples and add that to the mix would 100%, help make the study stronger. So we don't have we don't have fire scar samples for this, but certainly something that, we could think about adding and supporting the work.
Alrighty. Don had a question wondering if you know of any prescriptions beyond what you mentioned, occasional thinning and occasional fire and thinning back conifers. So do you know of any prescriptions for thinning of aspen groves that would make them more resilient to climate change that might be relevant to this type of aspen population?
Yeah, that's a good question too, Don. I think it would be really cool to set up some sort of experimental study to test some of these prescriptions. You're probably familiar with, well, maybe not, but Connor Crouch, a colleague from NAU, has been doing a fair amount of aspen research the last while. He presented a couple weeks ago, I believe, here, and Connor put together a really neat review paper where he addresses some of these like aspen management concerns. And that was a resource for us when we were thinking about what the park could do. But in terms of actual kind of prescriptions that have been put on the ground, I would say, no, I haven't seen anything. I've certainly had conversations with folks about it, and it varies. We were out in Wyoming on the Bighorns, and they had an aspen patch they were really too scared to do anything with, and they were like, "Oh, we're just going to leave it here," and hope for the best. But yeah, I think when you speak from manager to manager, they all have different views, but it would be really handy to have like some sort of experimental study set up to look at some of these prescriptions and see how, actually how they fare.
Alrighty, and we have someone raising their hand who asked to come off of mute and ask, so go ahead, Katie.
Awesome, thank you. I'm just really bad at like typing questions while I'm trying to listen to answers, so I appreciate it. Yeah, Gabby, that was a really awesome talk and so cool that you have aspen and Chihuahua pine at your site. Like, wow, amazing. I was interested in, the kind of framing was that this is Aspen Southern Range, kind of Southern Range Limit, and Chihuahua Pine's Northern Range Limit. So I was surprised to see that Chihuahua Pine seemed to actually be more sensitive to drought, and where you would expect if it's at its northern range limit, maybe it would actually be more limited by cold or frost or things like that. And so I'm wondering if like how the climate at Saguaro National Park compares to Chihuahua pine, the climate that Chihuahua pine occupies throughout its range, and is it just because it's a lower elevation that it actually is a hotter portion of the range, even though it's at that northern limit? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And that's a really good thought. And so I might phone a friend here just because Pete is a lot more familiar with Chihuahua Pine's distribution. And so Pete, I don't know if you want to comment on that in terms of how the climate compares across its distribution.
Sure, I would be happy to comment on a little bit. The short answer being we don't really know. So, like with many ecological situations, we have observations and some information which give us a bit of insight into a complex picture, but it's not quite clear. The very northern limit of the whole species of Chihuahua pine, Pinus lyophila, is farther north in Arizona above the Mogollon Rim, pushing closer to 8,000 feet, and sites that are substantially colder than the Saguaro National Park sites. And then this same species that is only found in really isolated patches in Arizona and New Mexico consolidates into a very substantial range all the way through central and into southern Mexico, with different varieties recognized in there. And so, these same kinds of questions, like when you look at any really wide-ranging species like Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, taken as a whole species, they grow in such a diversity of conditions that it's really hard to generalize. Possibly some answers that focused in more on genetics, which was not a part of this study, might give us some more clues. Would also add, and if anyone else on this call, on this webinar, is working with Chihuahua pine, we have been studying it for a number of years now. And it really does seem fascinating in the Southwest to try to understand why it is or is not present in certain places. Sometimes it seems very random. Excuse me. So trying to get a handle on some of those drivers would be great ideas for future research.
Awesome, thank you.
Katie, did that kind of answer what you were looking for?
Yes, for sure. And I'm also curious about Chihuahua pine. So yeah, looking forward to the future research.
Alrighty. I just have a couple more. You mentioned that under RCP 6.0 and above, aspen will likely not be viable in this area by the end of the century. So this might be a little bit theoretical, but just wondering if you have any idea how far north or under what climate conditions aspen would persist.
Yeah, that's a nice question, actually, because it kind of ties into some of the other research I have done on aspen. So I think, it's never a simple answer. I'll start with that. But regardless, we're seeing at least on the growth end of things, that these warmer, drier conditions moving into this 21st century have had a negative impact on aspen growth more broadly when you look at the sort of tree ring data. And that was, more prominent in these southern distributions. So I think as, we start to see those dry conditions shift further up north, we're going to start to see those same responses in those areas, higher up. Whether I know how quickly that's going to happen, I don't know. That really just depends on the climate, moving forward, which I think is just uncertain, especially when you're thinking about precipitation. And so it's hard to know exactly, Rachel, but I would say that you're going to see, these systems that they're southern, these southern edge distributions, what's happening here, are indications of what could be happening as we start to see those drier conditions move further north. Which I don't think is going to be an overnight thing, but I also don't think it's not, in the next sort of lifetime or two. It is possible.
Yeah, absolutely, actively happening now. So I guess that this kind of ties into one more question I have about the management implications, which is, and I know that this is a little theoretical as well, but we have kind of limited refugia locations in any given geographic area. And so as we're making these decisions about what species to try to, protect in these refugia, areas of refugia that are wetter and cooler, do you have any recommendations for managers of how to make that prioritization, how to make those decisions?
Yeah, I think it just comes down to what the park's managing for, or what they're looking for. So regardless, all these species provide different ecosystem services, and whatever's most important to them and what they're managing for is probably what they should be prioritizing. I am obviously a bit of an advocate for aspen. I may be a bit biased, but it's a keystone species. It provides a lot of ecosystem services, and so I'm all for trying to retain the species on the landscape. But I'm also, and I try not to be pessimistic, but I'm also not optimistic, based on the work that we've done. Its futures aren't looking solid. So. It really just comes down to what the park or the forest managers are trying to keep on their landscape. If aspen's bringing in tourism and things like that, then go for it. That's going to benefit the park. But if you're really trying to maintain kind of ecological function, thinking about things like Chihuahua pine providing similar ecosystem services to that of ponderosa pine, like maybe we should be investing in that now so that we can still have this forest here in the next sort of 50 to 100 years, right? And so, yeah, it just comes down to what, they're trying to manage for. And I'm curious, I know there's folks on the call from the Saguaro National Park, thinking about refugia, like that was one thing. I know I've put it in recommendations and it was in the report that we submitted to you all. But, are there off the top of your heads, do you have any places in the park that you could think of putting in climate refugia for some of these species? And I realize you can't speak, but, feel free to drop a comment in the chat.
All right, and if you want to reach out to Gabby to continue the conversation, her email address is in the chat. Gabrielle said the north slope of Mica Mountain is the location. And most are probably in the climate refugia now. So.
Yeah, and that is a sad reality as well, is that they're already in the refugia.
Yeah.
And facing these impacts. So I think all we can do is try to slow it down, but I don't think we can stop it.
Alrighty, well, on that note, Gabby, thank you so much for coming on today and doing this excellent presentation. Thank you for answering our questions. Thank you to everyone online for being here today. And I look forward to seeing where this research takes you in the future. Like I said, a recording of this webinar will be available, and we look forward to having you on again in the future. Thank you so much, Gabby.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks again for hosting us, and to all those who joined to listen in.